afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. My name is Stephen Frois. I'm going to be facilitating today's webinar with our presenter, Josh Stamer. For anyone not familiar with our firm, Foundation Source is the nation's largest provider of comprehensive support services for private foundations. Our services include administrative support, active compliance monitoring, tax and legal expertise, online foundation management tools, and philanthropic advisory services. Today, we're going to discuss the charitable giving landscape and rethink how to approach and collaborate on these opportunities. We hope that today's session can help you and your team prepare and navigate conversations around philanthropy with your best clients. Questions throughout the webinar today can be submitted through the GoToWebinar dashboard on your screen. We will leave some time at the end of today's presentation to address those questions. Our presenter today is Josh Stamer, one of our senior managing directors for the Southern Pacific area here at Foundation Source. Josh works closely with wealth managers and financial advisors, attorneys, and donors who either have or are interested in establishing a private foundation. I'll go ahead now and turn it over to Josh for today's presentation on shaping client conversations.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. Just making sure that you can hear me okay.
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Thank you. So, hi, everyone. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Josh Stamer, and I'm the Senior Managing Director with Foundation Source for the Southern Pacific region of the U.S. I really appreciate the opportunity to lead this discussion today. This is one of my favorite areas to speak on, and I believe it's one of the most important topics that our clients and their trusted advisors can have, especially during this time of year. Statistics show us that well over half of affluent and wealthy families make their annual decisions around giving from October through December. In fact, over 30% of giving is done during the month of December alone. And furthermore, 12% of all giving in the U.S. is done in the last 3 days of the calendar year. So what does this tell us? Well, as trusted advisors to individuals, families, and companies, there's no time more important to have the conversation about philanthropy and charitable giving with your best clients. Our session today is aimed at the why and the how of this very conversation, shaping client conversations. The presentation is structured as a short, dialogue-driven conversation focused on 3 segments. First, we'll look at the three drivers of the why behind having the conversation about philanthropy and charitable giving. The second segment will focus on 3 overview discussion areas for advisors to explore with their own clients. And then finally, we'll review 3 strategies for the audience to take away that have worked for me and some of my top advisors who have successfully made having the conversation of charitable giving a hallmark of their practice. So you heard me right. We're going to tackle this enormous topic of having effective client conversations in about 10 PowerPoint slides. So what should you leave with today? Well, hopefully a little bit of statistical content, a bit of understanding around some topics that promote meaningful discussion with your clients, and a few takeaway strategies to further your practice in this topic. So Steve, with that said, let's go ahead and dive into the presentation. And as you mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, we would love to hear them. We'll try to answer, Stephen and I will try to answer as many of them as we can at the end of the session today. But if we don't get to your question at the end, please know that we'll be happy to follow up with you and follow up. So Steve, I'm going to click through to the first slide just to make sure that you can see my screen here. You should see where it says why it matters at the top left.
Yep, we got you.
Perfect. So again, talking about why the conversation of charitable giving and philanthropy matters to our best clients really starts with, as you mentioned, Steve, understanding kind of the landscape for charitable giving as it is. So this first graph that I've put on the screen shows the total giving in the United States from the years 1978 through 2018. And it's kind of a large graph, lots of ups and downs, with the exception of kind of the downturn in the market in 2008, we can see that the annual giving of individuals, families, and companies in the United States has increased every year to the tune of, during 2018, over $420 billion were given. And that's obviously an impressive number. The United States by far is the most actively charitable country in the world. The next graph I like to bring up because it shows where a lot of these charitable assets are currently held, or where they reside, if you will. Overall, the majority of money and gifts that are given in the United States are done through the medium of kind of checkbook philanthropy, right? Meaning that the majority of people are giving to schools, to churches, to their favorite charities, directly out of their checking account or out of their pocket. But for a lot of our clients, especially those that are affluent and wealthy, have designated charitable giving vehicles. And this graph shows where the majority of those assets reside within these different vehicles. Obviously, you can see that private foundations retain the vast majority of charitable giving assets to the tune of almost $700 billion, all the way through the other vehicles that our clients employ as well, to nearly $900 billion in charitable giving assets. This is obviously a huge number, the vast majority of which is all tied to an advisor or an advisory team. So this makes this conversation very important. Finally, U.S. Trust and Philanthropic Initiative put out a study on philanthropic conversation, and I always find this statistic to be vital for this conversation. And it says that 90% of high net worth, meaning above $1 million in the investable marketplace, say that philanthropy should be discussed within the first several meetings with the financial advisor. Conversely, less than 50%, are happy with the charitable conversations they're having with their advisors. So obviously we can see that there's a disconnect here, and stressing the importance of this conversation is hopefully going to show some connection in that area. This next slide focuses on philanthropy as a top financial issue for our top clients. A group called the Spectrum Group in Chicago put out a study called Charitable Giving in the Ultra High Net Worth. Now, ultra high net worth being designated as upwards of $30 million of investable assets. And they took this demographic and asked them about the top issues facing them in the financial marketplace. The first item is probably not a surprise. Obviously, individuals with upwards of $30 million, tax minimization is a huge mindful issue for them, followed by asset management, followed closely by estate planning, and interestingly enough, philanthropy coming in as the fourth most important issue or top issue for the ultra high net worth clients that were surveyed. Now, what's really interesting, Steve, about this slide is that not only did philanthropy come in as the fourth top issue for this client base as a standalone, but when you think about this, the three items directly above the topic of philanthropy, philanthropy actually plays a huge role in all three of those areas. In tax minimization, obviously certainly clients who have sold a business or had some sort of significant liquidity or wealth changing event, tax minimization being a huge issue for them, philanthropy can play a huge part in that tax minimization strategy. Many make end of the year gifts, they create private foundations, they start donor advised funds and other vehicles because it plays a part of that tax minimization strategy. Asset management, we've heard over the last several years how big impact investing has become in the financial marketplace, and philanthropy and social impact have a huge play in the asset management piece. So philanthropy is injected directly into the asset management conversation. And then finally, estate planning with our clients having discussions around family and inheritance and wealth and long-term guidance. Philanthropy also plays a huge role in that. So again, philanthropy as a standalone, a top four financial issue for our best and top clients, but certainly playing a role in each of these top issues as a component. So the world of philanthropy is rapidly changing, which obviously comes as a surprise to no one. Technology has played a factor. The financial marketplace has played a factor. But one of the items that I always like to show in all of my presentations is this piece that Forbes put out. And it says that 8 out of 10 in 1950, 8 of the top 10 persons on the Forbes list of richest Americans had inherited their wealth. By 2015, and from 2015 to now in 2019, this statistic has actually increased significantly to almost 9 out of 10. But 8 out of 10 persons on the Forbes list of richest Americans had self-made their wealth. So that's really important to understand that just in the last 50 plus years, what a large change has occurred in this marketplace. This next statistic is really interesting as well. So we have roughly 2,200 billionaires now in the world. Of those 2,200, 1,490 have been designated as self-made. 454 had inherited some component of their wealth and have since grown that wealth. And 264 out of 2,200 have been designated as inherited their wealth. So this lets us know that, well, it lets us know many things. One of the things that lets us know is the amount of change that's occurred here in the financial marketplace and how people are looking at things so much differently. Finally, the Johnson Center for Philanthropy did a study a couple of years back in 2014 where they looked at the word philanthropy. And they asked to a specific demographic of ultra high net worth investors who were 60 years and older what the word philanthropy meant. And the response was very interesting, but maybe expected. The response was that philanthropy meant giving money away. For the demographic of 60 and above, largely those clients associated the word philanthropy with giving money away. They did the same study for the demographic of 30 and under. They asked what the word philanthropy meant, and the response was much different. The response was very in line with making a change. Really had less to do with actually giving money away and more to do with affecting change. So I think that that's really interesting when we think about how the world of philanthropy is changing. So the next segment, as we kind of start the second segment of the presentation, is really around some overview ideas or discussion points that you can have with your clients based on some of the things that we've understood and realized here at Foundation Source, and myself, particularly in working with some of my top advisors. And one of these is this idea around profiling and making assumptions. Now, as trusted advisors to a high net worth community and certainly an ultra high net worth community, we're often forced to make certain assumptions to effectively do our jobs. We're also become experts in profiling and understanding different needs of different clients. So I thought for this next slide, I would profile 4 of my existing clients that I work with and talk through some of the demographics and what makes each of them a little bit different. So the first example here is some of the statistics that would describe one of my clients. 47-year-old man, married, 3 children, one of whom has special needs, living in San Francisco, working in the technology sector with roughly $50 million of investable assets. The second profile, a woman who's 81 years old. She's widowed. She has no children, unfortunately dealing with a terminal illness, living in Little Rock, Arkansas, with roughly $19 million in investable assets. The third profile, a couple, roughly late 60s, retired, 5 children, 8 grandchildren, living here in Los Angeles, a little over $2 billion in investable assets. And finally, a woman, 41, divorced, 2 children, working full-time, living in Fresno, California, with $120,000 in investable assets. Now, Steve, the reason I bring up these profiles is obviously it's easy to make assumptions based on wealth management as to how we might look at and treat different clients that we work with. What I find is interesting is one of these clients, and you can probably guess who I'm alluding to, maybe doesn't necessarily fit with the others. However, that bottom client that I'm profiling is the sole director of a $160 million family foundation. Now, all of these assets reside within the family foundation, thus why this individual is works full time. She's a very busy mom. But from a advisory perspective, this is a $160 million platform that her advisory team is overseeing. So that certainly means one thing to the advisor, and it maybe means something different to herself and her family. So the point being is we work with different folks on an ongoing basis. We work with different people with different backgrounds who are all going through different stimuli in their own environment. And it's important to be mindful of some of the profiling and the assumptions that can take place in having the conversation, especially of philanthropy with our own clients. So the next concept, Steve, is a slide that I like to call gates, buildings, and tombstones. And that certainly might not make a lot of sense on the surface, but I promise I'll get to something. I'll get to the point as we go through this slide. Really about the conversation of comprehending legacy. And I always find this idea of legacy to be very interesting when I'm working with my advisors who are in turn having these conversations with their clients. Because legacy is kind of a dynamic word. It often means something different to everyone to a certain extent. There's also this idea that I like to explore within the kind of the spectrum of legacy, excuse me, which is the concept of giving back. And there's a lot of folks in the philanthropic community that have some strong opinions about this word giving back. A lot of people don't like the word back being attached to the word giving. For a lot of folks, this concept of giving seems to be, or giving back seems to imply a necessity or a level of guilt or a level of expectation. And there's a lot of folks that think of this concept of legacy being more in tune with the word giving and less in tune with the word giving back. And I just think that that's interesting. So as we work through the slide, I'm going to bring up a series of pictures. And then I'm going to get a little bit of background on each picture as we discuss. So the first picture is obviously of this rather ugly looking mosquito. And I like to talk about the concept of legacy in bringing up the Gates family. Now, obviously, Bill and Melinda Gates and their incredible Gates Foundation have certainly set the standard and the pinnacle as the largest private foundation here in the United States. But when I think about the idea of legacy as in the dialogue of the Gates, I think it's fascinating to think about what other people perceive as legacy, and then what someone like Bill Gates may perceive as his own legacy. What I mean is when we think about Gates and we think about legacy, I think that a lot of people think in terms of, incredible wealth and, a software pioneer and a technology entrepreneur. However, Bill Gates himself is probably more intent on establishing his own legacy around something like being known as the person who hopefully cures malaria. Probably has very little to do with technology and his entrepreneurship pioneer than it does affecting something like eradicating malaria as a disease in the world. And I think that's fascinating because a lot of people have an idea of other people's legacy without really exploring their own.
Hey, Josh, I just wanted to jump in really quick here. I actually am not seeing the illustrations or the pictures on your screen.
The beautiful picture that I have been talking about for the last couple of minutes, so that's what it was. Now it makes probably a little bit more sense. So still with me, Steve? You got a picture of a building with your name here up on the screen next?
We have it, yes.
Perfect. So the second idea around legacy is kind of this concept of a building with someone's name on it, right? And that concept seems to be a bit of a lightning rod for a lot of the clients that we work with. Some of our clients prefer to be very anonymous and very kind of back of the room when it comes to decisions around things like philanthropy and giving money. Others are very intentional in wanting their name associated with some of the things that they're doing. Now, a lot of people jump to this idea that that's very narcissistic and, giving should be something that's done without expectation of return. But I think that a lot of my clients approach something like putting their name on the side of a building with legacy around maybe having their future generations understand that, naming a cancer research facility after the family name is something that was very important to them and very important to future generations of the family. So I think that it's interesting when we talk about this idea of naming rights and buildings and that sort of thing. And then finally, which is kind of my favorite demographic, my favorite picture here, this is, you might have to squint your eyes and get a little closer to your computer screen, but this is Rodney Dangerfield's tombstone that's actually here in Los Angeles. And if you look at the bottom, the epitaph says, "There goes the neighborhood." So I like to think of this concept of legacy where you have something as deep and thought-provoking and meaningful as this concept of curing malaria, to the other side of the spectrum for someone like Rodney Dangerfield, who in his last will and testament and his final message to the world wanted it to be about making people laugh and instilling something like comedy that was very important to him. So as we look at three very different approaches to this concept of legacy, I think that it's important to have this conversation with our clients because the idea of legacy can really stretch across very different mediums. So Steve, I'm bringing up this next picture and I'm just confirming that you can see my screen because I don't want to get back into the place where I'm talking without seeing something. So you should see this yin yang symbol and the topic of impact and fulfillment up at the top of the screen. So make me feel better and tell me that you can see that.
Yes, we are good on the same page.
Perfect. All right. Well, if obviously if I start going down a path here and you're not seeing what I'm talking about, let me know. So following this concept of legacy, the next piece that I really like to bring up with my advisors to talk through with their clients is really this conversation of impact and fulfillment. Impact and fulfillment are two incredibly important areas of conversation for you to have with your best clients because they're both very, very meaningful things, especially in a conversation of philanthropy and charitable giving. So first, let's talk about this idea of impact. And I like to think about impact as the stimulus that you have on something else, right? So how many children were put through college because of a program or a scholarship fund that was established, or how many clean water initiatives were set up and how many different families were affected by something that one of our clients or donors did. The idea of impact is really kind of dynamic because it's challenging from a measurement perspective. Now, it's come a long way in this idea of measuring impact, which is terrific, but I think that it still presents a challenge to a lot of our donors because there's no built-in medium on measuring impact. And what I mean is when you think about something like sports, we kind of have a score, right? And a score is how we measure a sport. You can tell if someone's winning or losing based on a score. When you think about school, you have grades, and people can think about how they're doing with something based on a grade that they're getting. But when you think about impact, it's a little bit different when it comes to philanthropy. We can feel like we're having impact when maybe the numbers tell us that we're not necessarily having impact, which brings up this idea of fulfillment, which is really, in my opinion, the other side of the conversation around impact. If impact is how we affect or how other stimulus is affected, fulfillment is really how we are affected internally. It's kind of this concept of external being impact versus internal being fulfillment. And what I mean is many philanthropists that I work with consider kind of the pinnacle of achieving philanthropic and charitable giving success by matching impact and fulfillment. Many people give with the idea of impact in mind, and they can maybe make gifts that have incredible impact, like the measurements that I talked about before, number of kids put through school, or the success of a clean water project. However, if it doesn't make them feel good and it doesn't inspire them and it doesn't fulfill them, then a lot of times they're left with something to be desired. Now, conversely, others who give explicitly because it makes them feel good, it's not always having the most impact on the external stimulus. They're giving because it's a cause that they deeply care about, but sometimes it's not having the impact either because it's something that's being replicated and not enough research has been done. So this idea of impact and fulfillment, I always find very interesting, and certainly a great place to start a conversation with some of your clients. So Steve, as we kind of get into this next segment of the presentation, I always like to bring up this idea of preparation and navigation. So this next slide is really focused on that area. Too many times I sit down with advisors who think of the concept of philanthropy and charitable giving much like, as we've talked about before, as this idea of giving money away. And I think that they're a little bit limited sometimes in approaching something like philanthropy only as the idea of giving money away. But the other piece that I think is a little bit daunting for many advisors is this idea that the world of philanthropy and charitable giving is kind of challenging, kind of all over the place. There's lots of different terms to understand and navigate. I kind of created this word bubble here and threw in a lot of the words that I hear in association with philanthropy on a day-to-day basis that, you know, as someone who works as a professional in this space, are certainly words that I'm familiar with. But I know that for a lot of my advisors, even advisors who are working with some of the most affluent and wealthy clients in the world, aren't necessarily confident with. And we think about terms like, you know, the difference between donor advised funds and charitable trusts and community foundations, and then concepts like entrepreneurial philanthropy and venture philanthropy and impact investing. And sometimes it can be a little bit, like I said before, daunting, and it can be a little bit muddy. So how I like to think of this, especially for advisors who are maybe a little bit newer in having this conversation, is kind of 3 points. First, know the basics. I do think that it's important to have a background knowledge around this topic of philanthropy and charitable giving. You should really know the difference between a public charity and a private foundation, and you should know what a donor advised fund is, and you should know some basics around you know, how a client works with some of the charities and charitable organizations that they work with. So you really should know the basics, and I encourage my advisors to you know, utilize resources like Investopedia and utilize resources like foundationsource.com to get themselves a base of knowledge around this charitable giving marketplace. Second, don't overcomplicate. I think that a lot of advisors feel like they don't necessarily bring up the conversation because it can feel too complicated, and they can feel like a client is going to ask a question, or they're going to mistakenly stumble upon raising a question that they can't fully understand. You don't need to overcomplicate the conversation of philanthropy. A lot of times, as we're going to see in our next slide, it can be much easier than you think. And then finally, leveraging resources. There's always resources available to you, whether you're, you know, whether you're a wealth advisor who's working with a large wirehouse or a large firm, or you're an advisor who is working with in the scope of an independent network, or you're an attorney or a tax advisor. There's lots of resources available to you, both on the internet. Firms like ours, like Foundation Source, we love being part of these conversations. I spend personally upwards of 50% of my time in this education process, working with advisors, taking clients on a case-by-case scenario, and working through opportunities and examples to share with them to really get to the root cause of these deep conversations. So Steve, the next slide that I bring up is this idea around kind of our second takeaway, right? If we think about the first takeaway as knowing the basics and navigating the process and not getting overcomplicated, really the second takeaway that I offer up to people is this idea of rethinking your questions around the conversation of philanthropy and charitable giving. As I mentioned before, I think that too many advisors automatically do that same thing that many of our clients do, which is associate philanthropy and charitable giving with giving money away. So whether they shy away from raising the conversation because they look at it as a net negative to their assets under management, but it doesn't necessarily have to be raised in the way that you might think. For example, when I sit down and work with a client and raise the conversation, maybe for the first time, about charitable giving and philanthropy, I don't necessarily start talking about giving money away. I like to use questions like, what's on your bucket list? And what are you passionate about? And tell me about some of the things that really get you up in the morning, and tell me about some of the things that keep you up at night. These are conversations that an advisor can have with their client that can really kick off the conversation around charitable giving and philanthropy without being as blatant as, so when you die, where do you want your money to go, right? So, for example, the bucket list conversation. One of the things that I feel like I've become very proficient in, and many of the philanthropic advisors that I've encountered have become very good at, is taking a question like the bucket list and equating something that might not necessarily scream philanthropy and charitable giving into a way of having a meaningful dialogue about philanthropy and charitable giving with their client. One example that I like to use is I was working with a particular client who was self-professed not philanthropic, right? They decided that, they actually signed the giving pledge with Warren Buffett and the Gates Foundation, and really this individual was a full-time working business professional who really thought that, the Gates Foundation was a better steward of wealth for his long-term giving than he could ever be. So we sat down with the advisor and we talked about, this idea of philanthropy, and if he was getting a little bit older and potentially taking a step back from his busy professional world, some ideas around philanthropy and some of the things that he might like to be engaged with. But again, this idea of giving money away wasn't necessarily an easy conversation. So we started with the conversation of a bucket list and uncovered that this particular individual was crazy about fly fishing. He was passionate about fly fishing. It was a way for him to connect with his family. It was a way for him to get engaged in something that he really enjoyed and liked to pour his heart into. Now, it just so happens that this individual was also a veteran of the United States Armed Forces and while he considered himself not incredibly philanthropic, certainly cared a lot about veterans' causes. So we introduced him to an organization called Project Healing Waters. That's a terrific organization that works with returning combat veterans through a medium of teaching them fly fishing to, in many cases, help with PTSD and help re-entry into the workforce. And it's just an incredible program. And we took this individual donor, introduced him into this kind of team from Project Healing Waters, and we're able to take something that he was passionate about in fly fishing that he never really equated with philanthropy and charitable giving, and we're really able to make this incredible match to where now this incredibly successful, high net worth individual no longer identifies himself as not philanthropic, is one of the largest donors to this particular organization, and has really found a lot of meaning in that in that experience. So again, the takeaway here is don't necessarily think that it has to be that the conversation has to come from a place of giving money away. It can really start with a much broader piece and kind of go deeper from there. Steve, I'm going to move on to kind of the final slide in this third segment of takeaways. And I like to kind of broaden the conversation of philanthropy and charitable giving back to this idea of client conversations in general. And I always like to bring in kind of an outside medium, certainly outside of Foundation Source and really outside of charitable giving and philanthropy, that I think has been an incredible tool for myself coming from a business development background. And I think that trusted advisors, certainly wealth advisors, and certainly attorneys and CPAs that we work with many of the times, really identify themselves as this place of working with clients from a business development lens. This book that you see on the screen right now by Matt Dixon and Brent Adamson is called The Challenger Sale, taking control of the customer conversation. And again, really has little to do with philanthropy and charitable giving, but everything around profiling and how we work with our top clients. And it's a book that, that I recommend, that I'm certainly not associated with in any way. I don't get a kickback by promoting. But again, it's been a terrific resource for me over the course of my career in understanding how I think about relationships. The context of this book is really this idea around profiling clients and those that work with clients, specifically in business development. And it really talks about how people who are professionals who work with clients really, at the end of the day, are profiled down to one of 5 individual profiles. The first being the lone wolf. And the lone wolf is really somebody who kind of goes his own way, is usually very successful, however, really doesn't leverage a lot of resources and teams, really prefers to go his own way. The second is the hard worker. This is somebody who identifies themselves in their relationship with their clients as somebody who's just going to outwork everyone else. They're going to be first in, last to leave the office. They're going to be the ones who spend the majority of their time on resources, et cetera. The third is the interactive problem solver. So this is someone who identifies their primary role with their clients as somebody who's going to hear the problems that that client is having and then find ways to solve those problems. The fourth is the relationship builder, which in my experience working with wealth advisors is where the vast majority of wealth advisors that I work with kind of fall into this bucket. And that's the idea of being this relationship builder, being the person that your client can go to when they have questions, being the person that, is friends with them and they get to know their family and they become part of the core group of advisors for their client. And they really focus all of their work on building this relationship, which until I really kind of took an inner look at how I explored my own persona in working with clients, identified myself as a relationship builder as well. But finally, the fifth profile is what Adamson and Dixon refer to as the challenger. And the challenger is really makes a case that people who are working with clients on an ongoing basis, while they can certainly have terrific relationships and identify themselves in different ways as a lone wolf and hard worker, should really be focusing on challenging their clients, right? The challenger is the person that goes in and has the difficult conversations with their clients and maybe raises the concern around a certain investment or raises a concern around charitable giving and philanthropy when a client identifies as not philanthropic. And I think that it's important to understand this role that we all have as trusted advisors and working with clients who are affluent and wealthy around going out of the box and being this challenger role for them. And through this context of the book, it'll really show us how, A, the client really wants us to serve that role, and B, we're going to be much more effective in what we do in assuming that role. So Steve, I'm going to move on to the next slide here, and I know that we've gone through a lot here in the last few minutes, but just to recap these takeaways, I like to break it down like this. So prepare and navigate with your best client. It's really key to understanding where your conversation is coming from. So prepare when you're having these conversations with your best client. Make them a dedicated conversation. The clients that or the advisors that I work with that tend to do this the best have gotten to the place where they've made charitable giving and philanthropy a dedicated conversation. Now, maybe it didn't start out that way. Maybe it was started off as a bullet point in a, every 6-month well check type conversation with their client, but they've grown it and gotten it to the point of being prepared and being able to navigate this conversation as a dedicated conversation. Secondly, rethinking how you approach and collaborate, leveraging resources, knowing enough to be dangerous, but knowing when to bring in experts. And then finally, leveraging resources, like I mentioned, challenging your clients and differentiating yourself as a trusted advisor by bringing up a topic like philanthropy and charitable giving that maybe other advisors who are working with your clients are not already doing. So Steve, I'm going to go ahead and close with that recap. I'm going to bring up the next piece here, which is really just a little bit about Foundation Source, and I'll leave this on the screen for our audience to kind of take a look through. Again, really wanted this conversation today to not necessarily be specific to a medium of any one charitable vehicle, but really around the idea of understanding the market, understanding the landscape of philanthropy and charitable giving, and why it's important to have these client conversations. Secondly, introducing some concepts and some overview areas for our client, for our advisors to raise with their clients, and then really illustrating a few takeaways that have worked well for me and some of my advisors. So I'm going to pause there, Steve. I know that we've probably had some questions come up in the course of the presentation. So let me know what some of our folks on the line here are asking about.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Josh. I think the insight you provided us with today is really going to help lead conversations around philanthropy and also charitable planning. So with that said, we do have a few questions that came in. Before we dive into the questions, I do just also want to point out that we've attached our brochure to this presentation as well under the handout section. It's called Tips for the Talk, and this is a pretty neat guide that'll help lead these conversations around philanthropy and charitable planning. There's some checklists and some questions that you can certainly consider going through with some of your clients that have assets earmarked for charitable planning. So in the handout section, don't forget to download that brochure. So with that said, the first question that came in is, how much money does a client need before I'm able to have a conversation about private foundations?
Okay, so pretty direct question right off the bat. I like it. It's an interesting question, Steve, and I go back to this kind of idea that philanthropy has changed, and it really has changed significantly for charitable vehicles over the last, 20, especially 20 to 25, call it 30 years. I think for a long time, the idea of having a private foundation was much different than it is now. It was really, the private foundation sector was really reserved for these families like, the Gates and the Rockefellers and the Ford families, which were very well-to-do, kind of well-known, very kind of public families that had incredible wealth, that had, or needed the structure of a private foundation. And really, Foundation Source as a firm was founded to really kind of change this idea of having a private foundation. Now, private foundations specifically are certainly the most flexible and control-laden of all charitable giving vehicles. But like I mentioned before, we're kind of out of reach, or at least considered out of reach, for a very long time. I think it would surprise a lot of people to learn that the average size of a private foundation in the U.S. right now is around $1 million in assets. Now, obviously, you have very large outliers like the Gates and the Fords and the Rockefellers, et cetera. However, you also have this newer demographic of families, corporations, and individuals who want the flexibility and want the control that comes along with having a private foundation, and look to firms like Foundation Source to help them achieve that. So kind of, I know, a long answer to a very pointed question, but we've at Foundation Source been effective in working with clients with an initial contribution of down around $500,000. To certainly, I like to use that $500,000 figure, which again, at $500,000, $500,000, is a private foundation going to be a great fit for every client? No, but really feel like that $500,000 to $1 million range is where every client who's considering a charitable vehicle should at least explore a private foundation as an option for them.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, Josh. I think one of the more common misconceptions about private foundations for a long time is, that you needed north of $5 million to start one. So knowing that the average is around $1 million is usually a surprise to some folks. So I think that's a great answer to that question.
Absolutely, Steve. And just one other point on that topic. I think that maybe more important than the initial contribution to a charitable vehicle really comes down to, what do our individuals, families, and companies want to do, right? Because a private foundation for one client who's got $1 million may be a terrific fit because they want to do some things that are really in line with a private foundation. Maybe they want to have expenses to the foundation. Maybe they want to do a scholarship program or give internationally or run their own program, things that you can really only do with a private foundation. And then, a foundation or an individual or family with a larger amount of assets that's starting off may not necessarily be the best fit for a private foundation due to the fact that they want to do some very specific things that line up with another charitable vehicle.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. I'll move on to the next question here. And the next one is, why do the majority of wealthy donors wait until the end of the year to make their gifting decisions?
Great question. I think that for the majority of folks on this call, they certainly wish it was a little bit more spread out. But I think that a lot of our clients, and speaking from my own clients who really view the end of the year as the time when they focus this conversation, I think it comes down to a couple of areas. I think that there's a lot of charitable vehicles that are actually started at the end of the year. Obviously, there's some drivers around, tax minimization and investment management that play into that, right? A lot of times if clients are going to make a significant charitable gift because they've had a high income year or they've had a liquidity event, they do it toward the end of the year because there's some tax minimization strategies involved. However, outside of that, right, I think that we're still talking about the majority of clients who even have an existing charitable vehicle who still consider kind of that end of the year when they're going to make the majority of their giving decisions. I think that there's several factors. Thanksgiving seems to be a point in time where a lot of our families tend to get together in person. A lot of my clients use the opportunity to sit around a table together and talk about something as meaningful and impactful as philanthropy as part of their Thanksgiving conversation, and they make some of those decisions. I think it's a built-in time when a lot of people get together. Obviously, giving in general seems to be more top of mind during the last 3 months of the year with some of the holidays, the holiday season, kind of creating that thought process for a lot of our folks. But I think it's also a time of planning when people are evaluating where they'd like to make a change and be effective going into the new year. So I think that that's primarily where we see a lot of our clients waiting until the end of the year to have these conversations. Now, at the end of the day, a lot of times has it just been put off during the year and it kind of happens to fall into this last 3 months of the year? Absolutely. However, we as advisors need to be mindful of this and need to be prepared to be responsive to questions, but also be able to raise the conversation with our clients that have not otherwise brought it up to us.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. I've got one last question here, and this is an interesting one. It's not a question that we get often, but when it does come up, it's a pretty interesting conversation, and I think advisors are usually surprised to find the answer to this. And it actually is, who manages our clients' assets? So, assuming that we're providing administrative support for a private foundation, who is managing the assets?
Yeah, great question, Steve. And it's probably the easiest question that you've given me, right? Here at Foundation Source, we have the opportunity to work with well over 1,500 private families, individuals, and corporation clients. However, we don't manage or custody any assets, right? Which is why we're such a terrific partner, specifically in working with wealth advisors, because we have no crossover. We're completely agnostic on the asset management side. The services that we provide for our clients, specifically in the private foundation medium, around, like you mentioned before, the operational partnership, the administration, the taxes, the accounting, the financial reporting, the compliance, all these incredible things that Foundation Source takes on for our clients. Our advisors are still the ones who retain the full management of those assets. It's the most flexible medium, speaking to a private foundation, on the investment management side as well. It gives our advisors the most flexibility and control over the investments that they help their clients with. But all of the asset management stays with the advisors. And excuse me, Stephen. Foundation Source is really a true partner in the overall operational capacity to run a private foundation.
Awesome. Well, Josh, thank you very much for the answers to those questions, and thank you again for your time and the presentation today. That is all the time and all the questions that we have. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email Josh. His email address is on the screen there, jstamer@foundationsource.com. And again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everyone.